Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Road to World War II, 1931 to 1934 by Epic History. Now this is pretty exciting, a new Epic History video on the Second World War. It also ties in pretty nicely with the recent series on 20th century Chinese history, where we got to talk about the development of the war from the Chinese perspective. Now we'll get to zoom out and talk about the war more generally around the globe. Really fascinating stuff. I don't know if this series is going to go through the entirety of the Second World War, or maybe just cover the build-up, but whatever it is, I am excited to get into it. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. Ferdinand Foch. Yeah, from 1919, and a couple people actually saw this coming. Not all, but some.
1931. The world's leading powers are reeling from the impact of the Great Depression. Global trade has collapsed by 2/3. Unemployment is soaring. Economies around the world are in turmoil. In the United States, the world's largest economy, President Herbert Hoover struggles to provide an effective response.
Yeah.
Great Britain, ruling the world's largest empire, is in financial and political crisis. France, ruling the second largest empire, is slightly better protected, but will soon face economic challenges of her own. The Soviet Union, the world's only major socialist state, remains an international pariah. It is therefore largely insulated from the global crisis and is about to complete Stalin's first 5-year plan.
Yeah, I guess that the Soviet Union is reaping both the benefits and the disadvantages of being a global pariah. They've very much been cut off from the global community in terms of trade and politics. Not entirely cut off, obviously, and so that hasn't been great for the USSR, but as has just been pointed out, it does mean they are a little more insulated from the consequences of the Depression compared to most countries around the world.
A program intended to rapidly boost Soviet industrial and agricultural output. In Asia, China escapes the worst of the Depression, but faces crises of its own.
Yeah, I mean, China, as we've covered in Epic History's recent series on this time period of Chinese history, they've really got their own thing going on. This is an era of incredible chaos and infighting and political discontent in China.
That year, devastating floods claim an estimated 2 million lives, while Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government fights a brutal civil war against Chinese communist rebels.
Yeah.
In 10 years, these 5 states, the USA, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China, will constitute the major Allied powers in the largest conflict in human history, World War II. However, in 1931, there is little to indicate that such a catastrophe is looming or inevitable. But that year, these same world events are shaping the paths of 3 other nations. Germany.
Let's get to our antagonists.
Humbled and humiliated by defeat in World War I, is now a fragile democratic republic.
Yeah.
No nation is hit harder by the Great Depression than Germany.
Germany is really hit incredibly hard. Now look, in the aftermath of the First World War, it's not like things are going well for Germany, right? Obviously, the German economy has taken a massive hit. German prestige and self-image has taken a massive hit, especially in those first few years after the war. Things are not going well. But by the sort of mid to late 1920s, things are starting to stabilize a little bit. Now, the Weimar government is still a pretty weak and unstable one. There are still signs of instability, but there are also signs that things are improving. For example, in the mid-1920s, you get the Dawes Plan, which was essentially the United States stepping in with loans to try and help Germany pay off some of the debts it owed to the winning powers of the First World War. Germany had really been crippled by these costs that had been imposed on it through the Treaty of Versailles. And so that was a bit of a boost to the German economy, right? So once again, it's not like things were going amazing, but there was hope as we moved into the late 1920s, and there were a lot of positives in Weimar Germany. Berlin, in particular, was this very active, progressive social scene. There's a lot of advancement in the humanities and the social sciences and the sciences and all this good stuff. But the Great Depression really is going to hit Germany hard and send it in this very negative direction. What it really does is empower forces that already existed in Germany, but it will really bring them to the forefront.
Thanks to its reliance on US loans, which have now ended abruptly.
Right. Yeah, exactly, and let me replay that real quick, because they sort of made the point I was making as well.
By the Great Depression than Germany, thanks to its reliance on US loans, which have now ended abruptly.
Right, so not only is Germany being hit by the Great Depression in the same way everybody is, but these US loans have now been cut off, and they were in many ways a lifeline for post-war Germany, or interwar Germany. And so now things are really going to deteriorate.
Banks and businesses collapse. Unemployment leaps to 24% and will peak the following year at 40%.
Jesus Christ. 40%. That is crazy. 40%. So almost half of your working population is not working, is out of a job. You can see how that leads to incredible levels of political discontent. People begin to get radicalized. They start to find scapegoats to blame, and those scapegoats are identified by new political figures on the scene. Adolf, who we will see soon. Although, of course, there were a bunch of different factions that grew during this era. The Nazis are the most famous of the bunch for obvious reasons, but there were a whole bunch of different radical groups that saw their popularity on the rise as people became angrier and angrier with the state of their government and the economy.
In July, President Hoover offers some relief. Germany's war reparations, the money she must pay to the victors of World War I, will be suspended. But the hardship experienced by ordinary Germans is reshaping German politics.
Yeah, unfortunately, though that is another lifeline for Germany, the country's already sort of entered into a tailspin at this point. The events have been set into motion, and it's a little too late to stop things.
As support drifts to the far left and far right. Italy is now a one-party fascist state, ruled by dictator Benito Mussolini.
I mean, Italy is first to this, right? Now, I know during the Second World War, Mussolini sort of becomes the little brother to Hitler. He plays second string, but Mussolini was the first successful fascist leader on the scene. In many ways, Hitler was following in the footsteps of Mussolini, who was the first to do a lot of the things that Hitler would replicate in Germany.
Who's held power since 1922. Italy is also hit hard by the Depression, though massive state intervention alleviates some of the pain. And in East Asia, the Empire of Japan. Here, the impact of the Depression is not as severe. But within this mixed democracy, there are alarming signs of political extremism and militarism.
Yeah, I mean, you really see during this era a global trend, which is the rise of political radicalism, the rise of militarism, the rise of far-right politics. You see that in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, in Spain, most notably. But you do see those trends repeating in countries like France and the US and the UK, right? Now those countries, I mean, France gets taken over by Germany, but those countries do not face a fascist takeover internally of their own, right? The UK and the US managed to resist that. I think in the case of the US, you could argue, in large part, due to the action of someone like an FDR, who was able to ward off some of the most negative consequences of this time period. But you do see rising militarism and far-right politics in a lot of countries around the world. Just in some of them, those far-right forces managed to take power more effectively.
In 9 years, these 3 states, Germany, Italy, and Japan, will form a military alliance commonly known as the Axis. All have something in common. Germany, unified in 1871. Italy, unified in 1861. Japan, an ancient state reinvented by the Meiji Restoration of 1868.
Sure, though I would argue this sort of sets Japan apart from the other two. I mean, yes, Japan went through this imperial restoration, through this major change, but I'd argue that is pretty different from the unifications that Germany and Italy experienced. I mean, a lot of countries went through the type of thing that Japan did, maybe not to that extent. So I don't know if they all share that in common, but these three are all, powers who they feel sort of underrepresented on the global stage. 3 countries who are striving for more feel like, because either they're relatively new countries, like the two on the left, or because, Japan, as an Asian power, feels it's not respected by these great European powers and the US. All 3 of these countries feel like they deserve more than they're getting, and since it's not being given to them, they're going to take it by force. So I think that is something that these countries share in common. Of course, all of them sort of look back to some type of golden age or great history. Well, really, a lot of political movements do that, but particularly the fascist movements of this era really were sort of hearkening back to some imagined golden age that each country had experienced. And when I say imagined, I mean, look, in the case of Italy, of course, they're looking back to the Roman Empire. That's something that really happened, but the way that it was talked about and the way it was portrayed by Mussolini and the fascists of the time was not really in line with the history of what really went on with the Roman Empire. That's what I mean by some imagined version of the past.
In historic terms, all are young nations, and all feel unjustly treated by the World War I peace settlement.
Yep. That's exactly right. Germany feels like it got shafted, which it did. To be fair, it really was badly done by Versailles. Italy and Japan, both of them were on the winning side of the war, but they both feel like they did not get the rewards that they were promised, either explicitly or implicitly, right? Both of them feel like, hey, we joined in with the war, we helped, though how much Italy helped, maybe not that much, but we helped, we should have gotten these big rewards, and they didn't. So they feel spited. In Germany, right, the worst done of the 3, they also feel incredibly, they're spited and spiteful towards the Allied powers of the First World War.
There are now growing demands for what older, established powers already have, and what they have been denied.
Yeah.
Empire. It is empire that is seen to confer status, security, and prosperity.
Empire. But what kind of an empire? Now, Japan, it really wants to build an empire of the era. It sort of wants to build something like the British had, where it conquers territory throughout Asia. But Italy and Germany have got some different ideas. Now, both of them are interested in colonial possessions, right? Italy is messing around in Ethiopia, for example. But both those two, particularly Germany, are perhaps a little more interested in building an empire back in Europe, right? The European empire building of the era has been focused on building empire and conquering colonies around the world outside of Europe, in Africa and Latin America, in Asia. But Germany and Italy are looking a little bit closer to home in terms of their empire building, right? When Hitler talks about Lebensraum, living space, right? The idea that the German people need more space to live and to spread their pure bloodline. He's not talking about sending them to Africa or Asia, typically. He's talking about sending them to Poland, right? So he's looking much closer to home.
A panacea to troubles at home. A fulfillment of destiny abroad. The 1930s, a decade of economic turmoil and failing international cooperation, will offer a window of opportunity to these three powers.
And of course, the thing with empire, right? Empire being a panacea to your issues at home, is that it really was not. In fact, this is an era in which empire was becoming more unwieldy than ever, at least empire in a more traditional form, right? I mean, following the Second World War, and during the Second World War, the British Empire will start to slowly break apart, right? It's becoming more expensive. Italy finds that out in Africa with Ethiopia. It's really difficult to do this whole empire thing. Frankly, a lot more trouble than it's worth, right? But there's still this idea that, Britain and France, they're these great respected countries with these empires, that we need to have something similar.
An opportunity to avenge past humiliations and seize the empires they believe are rightfully theirs. It is a path that will put Germany, Italy, and Japan on a collision course with the established great powers, with disastrous consequences for the world.
Yeah.
This video is sponsored by Hearts of Iron 4, the game that gives you the chance to lead your chosen nation through the 1930s and into the Great
It definitely feels like an appropriate sponsor for the video. So I've got Epic History's video linked down below, so you can go and check it out. And please give them a like, subscribe, show them support for making these fantastic videos that we all enjoy. And so with that in mind, I'll let the ad play through.
With control over economic planning, diplomacy, the organization of your armed forces, and of course, military strategy. Far from just simulating history, Hearts of Iron 4 lets you rewrite the script, with every decision opening up new historical paths. And Paradox, the creators of Hearts of Iron, are constantly adding new themes and features. The new expansion pack, No Compromise, No Surrender, brings even greater historical depth to the East Asian theater. It's a crucial Second World War front, with China's struggle particularly overlooked in the West, but one which we'll be covering in full in our own series. If you want to try Hearts of Iron 4...
I mean, we've covered a lot of China's World War II experiences in their series on China, which has been really fascinating.
Just click the link in our video description.
The entire world is suffering from a terrible crisis and lack of confidence. The last hopes of the world are now in our hands. Nikolai Tchulescu, President of the League of Nations General Assembly. Uh-oh. Not good.
The first major international crisis of the 1930s is in Manchuria, northeastern China.
This is going to be a real test of the authority and heft of the League of Nations.
Japanese nationalists see China as the natural arena for their imperial expansion.
And by the way, for those unfamiliar, the League of Nations was sort of a proto-UN, a proto-United Nations. Following the First World War, some of the leaders, Woodrow Wilson in particular, decided it was a good idea to have this international body in which everyone could come together and hash out their differences through words rather than through war. Now, it wasn't the first idea or the first time someone had suggested that idea, but, it was a lot more formalized than it had been previously. Now, the United States actually did not join the League of Nations because Wilson couldn't get Congress to support that. So the U.S. is out in the first place, which really delegitimized the League of Nations from the beginning. But it is this sort of international body, and so it's going to be facing some pretty serious challenges in, can it stop violations of international law? Can it stop growing tension and conflict? I mean, just look at the UN today and you might see the answer, but we'll find out.
See China as the natural arena for their imperial expansion. And Japan has been extending its influence here over many years.
Yeah.
There is already a large Japanese military force based in Dalian, known as the Kwantung Army. Now, nationalist officers from this army decide to force the hand of their own government. Acting on their own initiative, they blow up a section of Japanese-owned railway.
Yeah, the interesting thing with Japan in this period is that there were some politicians in the civilian government who were trying to prevent this from happening. But Japan's sort of a case of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, where instead of the civilian government controlling the military is basically dragging the government along, right? So the military, or even individual officers in the military, who were usually junior officers, but also usually had some type of implicit support from their superiors. Now, maybe the superiors wouldn't explicitly support this, but everyone sort of knew that they were all on the same page. And so the military is making the decisions and then sort of forcing the Japanese civilian government to come along with them. Now, that's not to say that there were no supporters within the Japanese government. There were no far-righters or militarists. There absolutely were. Just that the military was really the one taking the initiative here over the government.
A false flag operation that becomes known as the Mukden Incident. The Kwantung Army uses it as a pretext to invade Manchuria. Local Chinese troops are no match for modernized Japanese armed forces.
Yeah, Japan has gotten really good at building empire at this point. I mean, it showed everybody that when, a little less than 30 years ago, it had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan had shown it was on the same level as all these grand European powers, and in the decades since then, that has continued to be proven. Japan is truly a great power, a modern, militaristic, colonial power, and it is building its empire.
And Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek is more focused on fighting his internal communist enemies in the south.
Yeah, we talked about this in the videos on China, but this was a big mark against Chiang Kai-shek, and this made him quite unpopular among a lot of people, that instead of turning his attention against the foreign invaders and trying to defeat them, he continued to be more focused on the communists within China. There was a quote from him that went something like, he felt like the Japanese were a disease of the skin, whereas the communists were a disease of the heart, or something like that, where he's saying the communists are the more serious and deep issue, which is really a crazy thing to say when Japan is invading your territory. And that's how a lot of Chinese people felt. They were not happy that Chiang Kai-shek sort of refused to fully respond to this invasion.
In 3 months, the Japanese overrun most of Manchuria and turn it into their own puppet state, Manchuria.
Yeah.
The Japanese people are jubilant. The country has been gripped by war fever. But Western powers are outraged. Japan's attack is a flagrant breach of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This treaty, just 3 years old, committed all signatories, including Japan, to giving up war as a tool of national policy.
Yeah, so everyone signed a deal that said, we're not doing war anymore. That might seem a little silly and naive today, but it's really what they did, right? So that's 1928, pre-Great Depression, at a time when, there still certainly were tensions and issues. There was still rising militarism and far-right politics. Just look at Italy in the 1920s. But there was still some belief that maybe we could rein this in. Maybe this new League of Nations really could be an effective tool to stop something like World War I from breaking out again, right? So there was some hope. Now, Japan's response to all of this is that it feels these Western powers are being incredibly hypocritical, which they are, right? These Western powers have committed unnamed atrocities with the intent of building their own colonial empires. Now Japan is trying to do the same, and all these Western empires step up and say, you can't do that. Now, I would say that all of it is bad, that Japan definitely shouldn't be doing this, but from the perspective of these Japanese militarists, they're saying, hey, you did it, so why can't we? And, these Western powers, they definitely are coming from a hypocritical perspective.
The League of Nations, the international organization that is supposed to safeguard world peace, meets urgently in Geneva. But Japan is one of the League Council's 4 permanent members. And rather than condemn the attack, the League decides to send a commission to investigate.
Uh-oh.
A few weeks later, further fighting breaks out in...
that sounds pretty familiar to the type of toothless international institutions we have today, right? Like the UN, for example, where you can never get a firm action or a firm condemnation because either they can't agree on it or one of the, permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, usually will vote down such a thing, will veto it, which means that these international institutions just don't really have much authority.
Shanghai. But it is clear that Western powers, distracted by the economic crisis, will not go to war for the sake of China.
Yeah, so they do a bit of finger wagging. The Western powers say, you can't do that. But does anyone really step up to stop Japan? No, they don't. And so, Japan continues.
Their inaction is noted by observers across the world.
Yeah. War puts the stamp of nobility on those who have the courage to meet it. What is fascism from Mussolini? Yikes.
1932 begins with an Italian victory in Libya, where General Badoglio declares the end of a 9-year campaign to crush local resistance to Italian rule. Italy's armed forces have used chemical weapons, concentration camps, and mass executions against the Libyan people.
Yeah, this is where we see Italy's trying to get its slice of the colonial pie, in a way more similar to, say, the British Empire and Libya and then Ethiopia, and using chemical warfare, concentration camps, right? The Holocaust wasn't the first time concentration camps were used. They have been used several times in the past, in Africa in particular, by Italy, by Britain, of course, right? The United Kingdom sets up concentration camps while they were trying to build their colonial empire. So these things were not unprecedented. Now, of course, the scale that everything's done in the Second World War is absolutely unprecedented, but the Nazis didn't get it out of nowhere. A lot of the tactics they used were drawn from recent history.
Their successful pacification allows Mussolini to plan fresh conquests as he dreams of a new Roman Empire.
Yep.
In Western Europe, the site of bloody trench warfare just 14 years earlier, hopes for a lasting peace are based on the 1925 Locarno Pact. This guarantees Germany's western borders and requires Germany and its neighbours to submit all disputes to the League of Nations for mediation.
Yeah, there was a series of international agreements following the First World War where people agree, particularly with Germany, to mediate issues. There's an agreement to essentially shrink the sizes of navies around the world. Of course, Germany, through Versailles, is very limited in its own military. So there's this succession of agreements. And the purpose of all these agreements is to try and prevent another World War I. Of course, they fail, and what they get is something even worse than the First World War.
There is a mood of optimism among European diplomats, known as the spirit of Locarno, a hope that war in Europe may have been consigned to the past.
I think everybody was hoping, and, it's funny because Versailles was incredibly punitive against Germany, but that does start to fade a little bit in the following years, where everyone sort of focuses a little bit more on preventing war rather than just punishing Germany. And so I think there's a hope that this could be their sort of Congress of Vienna moment following the Napoleonic Wars, right? Where everyone comes together and they basically sign this agreement that they're going to negotiate rather than go to war. And look, the Congress of Vienna, it did not fully prevent war between the great powers of Europe, but you could argue it was relatively successful in forcing everyone to the negotiating table before they went to war with each other. Not 100% of the time, but you could probably make the case that it did avoid a couple of wars breaking out, at least on a grander scale, or at least prevented wars from escalating further and further and further in the way that the Napoleonic Wars did. So everyone's sort of hoping that that's what they're doing for the 20th century. Now, they're not, but that is kind of what they're going for.
In February, a World Disarmament Conference opens in Geneva, attended by 61 states. In June, the Lausanne Conference cuts German war reparations by 90%.
Right, and so, of course, this is a response to the growing economic crisis, but also a continuation of that shift away from being very punitive towards Germany, that was very much in the spirit of 1917, 1918, and towards people maybe genuinely trying to prevent war and put everybody on more of an equal footing. But you could say maybe too little too late at this point.
It will prove a false dawn. In Germany that year, federal elections are dominated by Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party.
Yeah.
His attitude to disarmament will soon become very clear.
Right, and, I talked about how the Great Depression would bring out elements of society that already existed, how people were incredibly discontent, right? So the Nazi Party has been in operation for years. They even tried to take over local government through the Beer Hall Putsch, tried to sort of pull a Mussolini years ago in the 1920s, which didn't work, right? So the Nazi Party has existed, in some ways has been growing in popularity, but didn't find too much success in the 1920s. But now, following the advent of the Depression, the Nazis are gaining incredible amounts of popularity and support among the German population.
Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, dictator Joseph Stalin continues his drive to make the state more resilient against external and internal enemies. His first 5-year plan focuses on expanding heavy industry, almost doubling the Soviet industrial workforce, and dramatically increasing output of steel, iron, and coal.
Yeah, so the Soviets go through a series of 5-year plans. Now, we talked about these when we were doing the series on China recently, where China under Mao had some successful 5-year plans, but then also some disastrous moments, like the Great Leap Forward, where nothing was really gained and millions of lives were lost, right? So the 5-year plans we're seeing here are quite a bit more effective and quite a bit less destructive. Not to say they weren't destructive at all, but Stalin, whatever you think of the guy, not a great guy, but he was very successful in building up the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union in only a few years in the interwar period.
It's impossible to be sure by how much, as official figures are constantly manipulated and inflated by communist officials.
Sure.
It's clear, however, that tank and aircraft production are expanding massively.
Yeah.
While in Ukraine, the completion of the Dnieper Dam, the largest in Europe, gives a major boost to Soviet electricity generation. But in the countryside, the policy of forcing peasants into large, state-controlled farms, collectivization, has proved disastrous.
And remember, when Russia has its revolution, the country is still overwhelmingly rural. I don't know the exact percentage. What is it, like still 80% rural? Maybe more than that, 90%? Whatever it is, it's still an overwhelmingly rural population where a lot of people, even at this point, I mean, things have started to change following the creation of the Soviet Union, but say in 1917, a lot of these, countryside communities are still living like peasants have lived for a long, long time. I mean, serfdom was abolished decades prior, but I mean, for a lot of those peasants, not much even changed after that, right? So this is a big, big change, not usually, or sometimes taken well, by the communities it's being imposed upon, right? These are communities that have been doing things a particular way for decades, if not hundreds of years, right? So it's a big moment of change and discontent in the Soviet Union.
A catastrophic collapse in the harvest has resulted in famine on a terrifying scale.
Yeah.
The total death toll over 4 years is estimated at between 6 and 9 million.
And once again, we sort of see a scaled up version of this later in China, right? But in some ways, a similar issue where the policies pursued can lead to, for a variety of reasons, the outbreak of famine.
Around half these deaths are in Ukraine,
Yeah.
where the disaster will be remembered as the Holodomor. Kazakhstan is also hard hit.
Damn. I mean, I think most people know about the Holodomor in Ukraine. I didn't know that Kazakhstan, in particular, was hit so badly as well.
Soviet authorities do everything they can to cover up the horrifying truth of what's happening. In Spain, where a new republic has been proclaimed the previous year, Prime Minister Manuel Azaña enacts sweeping reforms, aiming to modernize the country and curtail the influence of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Spanish Republic is going to go the way of the Weimar Republic. This was not a good time for new, fresh republics. They were shaky. They oftentimes experienced major threats from radicals in their country, particularly fascist radicals, which is what we're going to see in Spain and what, of course, you see in Italy and Germany, too.
Such moves are bitterly opposed by conservatives. In neighboring Portugal that summer, Antonio Salazar is appointed Prime Minister. He goes on to establish an authoritarian regime, Estado Novo, that he will lead until 1968.
Yeah, the new state, I believe, is the translation. And in Spain and Portugal, it's interesting. You have these two fascist leaders, or like quasi-fascist. There's some debate over what exactly they were. They were definitely far-right authoritarian leaders. But the reason it's maybe a little shaky is that both of them decide they do not want to join the war on the side of Germany and Italy, so they separate themselves from these other fascist leaders, and thus they're able to stay in power for decades later, right? So Franco in Spain and Salazar in Portugal managed to stay in power for decades and decades and decades, because though they run the far-right authoritarian dictatorship, they sort of keep things a little bit more subtle than their contemporaries in Italy in Germany, only just as much repression as they feel is necessary, which is still, brutal violence, but they are able to keep hold of power for a much longer time. And this is why, in fact, decades later, Spain and Portugal proved to be two of the most recalcitrant colonial powers among the European states, right after France and Britain have largely officially let go of their colonies. Now, there's the whole thing of neocolonialism, where though they officially relinquish control, in some ways they still maintain a lot of power, France in particular. But Portugal and Spain, Portugal in particular, literally will hold on to their colonial possessions tightly as long as they possibly can.
In the Middle East, the Kingdom of Iraq gains full independence from British rule and is admitted to the League of Nations. In Japan, the nationalist, militarist assault on the country's democracy steps up a gear. In February, a conspiracy to wipe out the country's leading liberal figures fails. But in May, a group of young naval officers shoot dead Prime Minister Inuke Tsuyoshi.
So not a good sign when you see rising political violence. Maybe think about the current moment. Anyway, not a good sign, right? Rising political violence. You see it in Japan in this era. You see it in Germany, right? Of course, the rise of these far-right movements, including but not exclusively limited to the Nazis, they involve a lot of street fighting, right? You've got these Freikorps units in Germany, which are discharged soldiers who were left with not much to do after the war. They're angry. They want to put their skills to use, and their skills involve warfare. And so oftentimes these men become very radicalized, and they join up with parties like the Nazi Party or other far-right parties, and they commit a lot of violence in the streets. You'll see a lot of street fighting in this time between the communists and the fascists, though of course in Germany soon the Nazis will have full power, and then that street fighting, it'll become more an official police state instead of, sort of disorganized street fighting between different political factions. But there's a lot of political violence, beatings, intimidation, assassinations in many of these different countries we're covering here.
In the United States of America, the 1932 presidential election is won by Franklin D. Roosevelt of the Democratic Party. To combat the effects of the Great Depression, he promises a New Deal for the American people. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. He will declare at his inauguration, "This nation asks for action, and action now."
He was right. The Hitler experiment had to be made sometime or other, and we shall now see what it will bring forth. Horace Rumbold, British ambassador to Germany. Yikes. 33.
Germany is in political deadlock. The previous year, federal elections had filled the Reichstag with Nazis, Social Democrats, and Communists, all of whom detest each other. In January, to break the impasse, President Hindenburg appoints a new Chancellor of Germany, the leader of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, and so what we see in Germany is that their conservative faction, right? So we're not talking about the fascists, we're talking about the conservatives, who, this is a pretty right-wing conservative faction, but these conservatives, guys like Hindenburg is the public face, Franz von Papen, these more traditional conservative types, they feel like they're losing their grip, which they are, and so they think, well, we need to hold on to power. How can we do that? Let's try and co-opt this fascist movement, right? We'll bring Hitler into government, we'll bring these fascists in, and we'll work with them, but we'll still maintain control of them. Of course, these radicals won't get the better of us, and so this is going to be our way to regain power, right? These conservative leaders feel like they can easily control this crazy Hitler character. Of course, they can't. They're completely wrong. things go off the rails and the Nazis gain complete control. And this is why, this is a lesson that a lot of people have taken, but which we should remember today, that it is not worth it for liberals or conservatives to work with these far-right or fascist movements, right? You can't co-opt them, it doesn't work, okay? Inevitably, these movements will take over, and you will be sucked in, either, willingly or not, right? And so we see in Germany that, they try this strategy of, we're going to co-opt and work with the fascist movement. Not a good idea, right? We should keep that in mind today.
It's predicted that more moderate and experienced politicians will be able to curb Hitler's more extreme views, of which there are many.
Yeah.
Adolf Hitler.
So if you hear that sort of rhetoric today, well, the moderates will gain control, or being in government will curb this person's extreme ideology, blah, blah, blah. Don't believe it. It doesn't work. It didn't work here. It doesn't work. Okay, so be very suspicious when you hear that type of language.
There are many. Adolf Hitler, born in Austria, had served as a senior private in the German army in World War I. After the war, he became leader of a fringe nationalist party based in Munich, the German Workers' Party. He renames it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party for short. Its policies combine extreme ethno-nationalism with total rejection of the Versailles peace settlement, hostility to capitalism and big business, and a rabid hatred of Jews, who are blamed for all Germany's woes. Above all, its stab-in-the-back defeat in World War I, which is itself a nationalist myth.
Yeah, so you've got the stabbed-in-the-back theory, which is this far-right idea in Germany that, we only lost the First World War because our traitorous government sold us out, right? It's this belief that we weren't really losing, we could have won, but these members of our government, made up of communists, social democrats, and Jews, they sold us out. They stabbed us in the back, right? That's the belief. It's not true, but that's what they believe. And of course, if you believe that is what the Weimar government is founded on, then you're not going to like the Weimar government. And the Nazis do not like the Weimar government, right? They're very opposed to this whole republic business. Extreme hostility to Jews, as is pointed out, who are scapegoated for all the different issues of Germany, right? The different economic issues, the issues with capital, all of this, because people they're feeling economic pain, they're discontented, they see things aren't fair in their lives politically and economically, right? Everyone recognizes that, but what the Nazis do is they provide someone to blame, and they point the finger at the Jews, and the communists, and the social democrats, right? And of course, the communists and social democrats are also said to be Jews, right? So it's, to the Nazis, it's all Jews, but also these other factions that are causing these issues, right? They're to blame for all of this, not the capital owners, business owners, the conservative leaders, none of that, obviously. It's the Jewish people and their allies in government, right? And so in that way, they're able to take some real economic pain and grievance and redirect it towards people who are not to blame, right? But they do it very effectively. That's scapegoating for you.
Many of Hitler's own deepest beliefs on Germany's need for an empire and living space at the expense of lesser races in the
living space is Lebensraum, as was mentioned earlier.
East, are available for anyone to read in Volume 2 of his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, published in 1926. Many Germans are disillusioned with centrist politicians and their failure to tackle the economic crisis.
Yep.
Hitler's powerful oratory and promise of radical solutions has strong appeal. Many middle-class Germans see the Nazis as the best way to keep the communists out of power. Now, with Hitler in charge, events begin to move quickly. In February 1933, a Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, sets fire to the Reichstag building in Berlin. He is acting alone, But the Nazis accused the German Communist Party of attempting a coup.
And there's been a lot of commentary over the Reichstag fire, right? Did he do this genuinely? And it was sort of turned into this big thing by the Nazis. Was it some type of false flag, like we saw from the Japanese in China? It's unclear, or at least I haven't read enough to make it clear. Whatever the case is, the Nazis use this situation, whether planned or not, a false flag or not, they use it to seize power, right? To make a power grab.
Civil and political rights are quickly suspended by emergency decree. Communists are jailed, their newspapers shut down. In March, Germany holds new elections, during which the Nazis' political rivals are harassed and terrorized by their paramilitary thugs, the SA and SS. The Nazi Party wins 44% of the vote and takes effective control of the Reichstag.
Jesus.
At the end of the month, it passes the Enabling Act. This frees Hitler from all constitutional checks and balances. He can now pass new laws without consulting the Reichstag or President Hindenburg. On the 1st of April...
Remember, Hindenburg and the conservative faction brought Hitler in on the pretense that they could probably control him. You see how badly that's gone? It's gone completely out of control.
The Nazis organize a one-day nationwide boycott of all Jewish businesses. By the end of the summer, Nazi concentration camps have opened at Oranienburg and Dachau.
Jesus Christ.
And all political parties in Germany have been banned, except the Nazi Party. Hitler's next target is the despised Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. Publicly, he rejects its war reparations and the so-called war guilt clause that blamed Germany for starting the war. In secret, he orders large-scale German rearmament in defiance of Versailles restrictions on the size of German armed forces.
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all of this is incredibly disturbing, obviously. Jesus Christ. But, of course, Hitler's not going to hold to this deal, right? The Treaty of Versailles. He doesn't respect it. He does not respect the foundations of the Weimar government, right? Of course, he doesn't feel bound to any of this, so he secretly starts rearming the German army. And in the years to follow, now this video apparently is going to stop in 1934, so we'll get to talk more about this next time, I suppose. In the years to follow, there's going to be a bunch of different points at which any of the Allied powers could have stepped in and stopped this. Now look, it's different to say that in retrospect versus during the moment, but that is the case. There are a bunch of different moments when, Germany was still in a weak position, Hitler was still cautious and a little worried about what was going to happen, but he kept pushing the line, and no one stepped in to stop him, right? So we're starting to see the beginning of that process with German rearmament, remilitarization. Not good. It's not the first step on the way to World War II, but it's a seriously important step on the way to the Second World War, because, we're talking about not just a fascist takeover of Germany, we're talking about how we got to a war that engulfed the entire world, right? And did untold damage and killed more people than any war ever has, right? How did we get to that point? Obviously, militarization here is a massive, massive part of that.
The existence of an illegal German air force is already widely known, and it's growing by 60 aircraft a month. The dramatic revival of nationalism and militarism in Germany is plain for all to see.
Yeah.
At the Geneva Disarmament Conference, Germany demands parity between its armed forces and those of France. When this is rejected, Germany quits the conference. The same month, Hitler withdraws Germany from the League of Nations. It is the League's second major blow of the year. In February, the League report on Japan's invasion of Manchuria had finally been presented to the General Assembly. It had called on Japan to withdraw from Manchuria.
Well, it's been spoiled here, but I was gonna say, let's try and guess, did Japan withdraw, or did they also quit, right? So it's becoming pretty clear the League of Nations can't do anything, can't do shit, right? And whenever you hear something you don't like, well, these increasingly militaristic countries, they just quit. They get out of there.
Japan responds by quitting the League of Nations. The international institutions designed to maintain peace are flailing.
Japan subsequently withdrew from the League of Nations. That body proved itself incapable of stemming the tide of aggression, either in Europe or in Asia.
A few foreign diplomats take the time to read Hitler's political manifesto, Mein Kampf. Some dismiss it as incoherent rambling, but others feel a deep sense of alarm.
I know this is sort of a cliche, but when people tell you who they are, believe them. You know what I mean? A lot of people, we sort of talked about this with how conservatives tried to co-opt the Nazi movement. A lot of people looked at Hitler's ideas and his writings and said, this guy's a psycho, no need to take him seriously, whatever. But there was a need to take him seriously, as we're seeing here, right? There were some people who recognized that, who read what he was writing and said, no, this is dangerous stuff. We should not be tolerating this fellow, right? There are a couple of, wise people who actually got that.
In Britain, Conservative Member of Parliament Winston Churchill warns of Germany's grim dictatorship and the return of its militaristic spirit.
Yeah, Churchill was one of the people who could sort of see ahead into the future a little bit.
But in the early 1930s, there is little appetite in Britain or France to confront Germany. The trauma of World War I is too fresh.
Yeah, and that's the issue, is that some people can see what's happening, even if you can't see it quite as clearly as Churchill did. People can see that Germany is going radically right. They are rearming. Now, everyone should know that, okay, it's time to step in to stop this. But people are just not willing to commit. Britain and France in particular, who are the two countries who would be most primed to step in, right? Both of them are reeling economically. The memories of the First World War are too fresh. The population is just not eager to step in and perhaps launch themselves into another war with Germany to stop this. Now, as we know in retrospect, this is something that you couldn't have known at the time, but as we know in retrospect, each time Hitler took one of these steps, like I said, he was being cautious, he was worried, he was actually in a relatively weak position compared to where he will be in 1939. And so, if these countries actually had decided to step in, we know that Hitler would have pulled back, right? We know that in retrospect. We have the sources to back that up, right? But, Britain and France never decided to make that move.
The public mood is one of pacifism.
Yeah.
In Britain, some even wonder if the Versailles Treaty had been too harsh on Germany. Perhaps some of Hitler's demands are not so unreasonable.
Well, the issue is that, the Treaty of Versailles really was not great, right? It didn't set us up for success in terms of how badly it punished Germany, but that does not mean you should be giving in to Hitler's demands. Now we're in a different situation.
Besides which, the Great Depression has led to severe cuts in military spending, meaning neither Britain nor France is in any state to fight a European war.
Yeah.
France is in the middle of a full-blown political and economic crisis. There have been
Typical.
10 governments in the last 3 years. National income has fallen by 30%. Defense spending has fallen by 25%.
Sheesh.
But the French are working on a major military project. which they believe will ensure national security for years to come.
Yeah, surely this will prevent France from ever being invaded again.
In the US, meanwhile, there is strong support for isolationism
Yep.
and a desire to avoid all overseas entanglements.
Yeah, so just like, it's like a slightly different phenomenon, but similar. Britain and France are feeling very damaged by the First World War. The brutal memories are still in the recent past that they do not want to get involved in another war. Now, it probably would not have been another war if they'd stepped in now to stop Germany, but they didn't know that, right? The US, it's a little different. The United States, the perspective is more like, we got involved in this conflict. What good did it do us? Not much. And so there's not much point getting involved in this war a whole ocean over and wasting lives and money and resources for something that doesn't really affect us, right? So the sentiment's slightly different. There's more an isolationist sentiment in the US, but it leads to the same thing from all these countries, which is inaction.
The US is not a member of the League of Nations,
No.
and facing 25% unemployment, Roosevelt is fully preoccupied with domestic politics.
Germany is again the Germany of before the war, with a new fanatical look in its eye. Harold Nicholson, British diplomat. Yeah. 34.
In June, Hitler orders a ruthless purge of the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing,
Yeah.
the SA, or Brown Shirts. Brown shirt violence and intimidation have been a crucial part of Hitler's rise to power.
Yeah, I sort of talked about earlier how now that the Nazis are seizing power, you don't really need as much of the brawling in the streets, because now you can run your own official government-sanctioned police state. So this is sort of part of that. The SA, the brown shirts, they were a big part, as was pointed out, of Hitler's rise to power. They were his shock troops in the streets. But now, frankly, they're causing more issues for him. They're sort of scary to a lot of the German population. We saw that the Nazis won more than 40% of the votes. There are a lot of people who are sort of on the edges of their electoral coalition, more middle-class types, who they might like a lot of what Hitler is saying, which is disturbing in its own right, but they don't like the scary fighting in the streets, right? That they want their political violence to be more state-sanctioned. They want it to be a little more official, done by a police officer, maybe. And so, Hitler, he needs to get rid of all these drunken SA guys, right? He also recognizes that, given their very strong military force, they're one of the few challenges to his position, right? And a lot of the SA guys are quite loyal to Röhm, who is leading them. And so Hitler's worried that they're not entirely loyal to him. They're causing issues. He doesn't need them in the same way he did in the past. And so it's time to purge a lot of these guys.
But they have served their purpose
Yes.
and are despised by the German army,
Yeah.
whose loyalty...
That's another thing. Not only is Hitler trying to appeal to some of his maybe more middle-class supporters, who, this type of thing puts them off. He's trying, now that he's in control of the government, he's trying to appeal to the army, the military. He wants to earn their loyalty, which he needs. And having your own paramilitary force is not a great way to earn loyalty from the actual military.
Hitler now values more.
Yeah.
In the so-called Night of the Long Knives, prominent SA leaders are rounded up and shot without trial.
Yep. And Röhm was the first one pictured there, Ernst Röhm.
Since 1932, Austria has been a right-wing, one-party state, led by Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss.
Great.
He regards the Nazis as dangerous rivals and has banned the party in Austria. In July 1934, Austrian Nazis assassinate Dollfuss, part of an attempted coup that is to pave the way to unification with Germany, known as Anschluss. They expect support from Hitler. But Mussolini has other ideas. He regards Austria as an important buffer state between Italy and Hitler's resurgent Germany. So he sends Italian...
So you can see at the moment, there's a bit of rivalry between these different fascist leaders. They're not quite sure they're on the same page yet. They're going to end up on the same page, but there's a bit of tension here, especially, as we talked about earlier, of course, Hitler is becoming the far more powerful figure, and of course is far more well-known. But Mussolini was the first one, right? He was the first of the major fascist leaders. He's already been in power for years, so he's sort of seeing Hitler, this new guy on the block, who copied all of his techniques in Germany, and he's like, whoa, I'm not so sure about this.
Troops to the Brenner Pass on the Austrian border, threatening to intervene if Hitler attempts to annex Austria. Germany's armed forces are still very weak. Hitler is forced to back down. The Nazi plot in Austria fails.
Yeah, for now. But I was talking earlier about how if someone just intervened, they would not have been facing a war with Germany. Hitler was more liable to back down at this point. Now, this is a piece of evidence in favor of that, right? And once again, we know from documents and evidence that have been gathered after the fact. But we can see here that at this point, Hitler still feels his international position to be relatively weak, which it is. Now, it's going to grow pretty strong by the time the war breaks out, but he doesn't even want to risk conflict with Italy at this point.
In August 1934, 86-year-old German President Hindenburg dies in office. As a war hero and statesman, he receives a lavish state funeral. Hindenburg...
And frankly, the two great war heroes of the First World War were Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And Ludendorff had been involved with the Nazis from a pretty early point. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff, frankly, you could really blame those two for a lot of what is happening now. Those two, they sort of ruled Germany kind of as a military dictatorship in the last part of the First World War, right? Sometimes, even with more power than the Kaiser, I think you can make that case. And it was those two who, instead of taking the responsibility on themselves, and you'd be like, well, we've lost, we gotta surrender, blah, 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 decided to pass on the responsibility to this, civilian government that was forming and shaky, right? Which leads to this whole stabbed in the back myth, which is perpetuated by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the two guys who are most responsible for Germany losing the war, who then pass on the responsibility, and then after the fact are like, can you believe we were stabbed in the back? So, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, a lot of responsibility lies on their shoulders for what is now happening.
Hindenburg's authority and conservatism has acted as a limited check on Hitler's actions. No longer. Hitler swiftly abolishes the office of president. He will now wield its powers in his new role as Führer of the German state and people. On the 20th of August, a new law requires all German military officers and civil servants to swear an oath of personal loyalty to Hitler.
So now, you can both have your professionalized civil service and military, but they can also be personally loyal to Hitler, right? So for Hitler, it's the best parts of the state and of his own personal sort of SA forces. He's now been able to combine them under his ultimate power as Führer.
That October, King Alexander of Yugoslavia makes a state visit to France. Alexander is regarded as a crucial unifying figure for the young Yugoslav state. But on his arrival in Marseille, he is assassinated by a Bulgarian nationalist.
Yikes.
French Foreign Minister Louis Barthou is also killed in the crossfire.
Jesus.
That autumn, Britain learns that the German army is now 300,000 strong.
Yeah.
3 times what is permitted under the Versailles Treaty.
Maybe time to do something?
Germany has further plans for expansion and mechanization. Tentative British steps towards rearmament begin, with a commitment to expand the Royal Air Force by 40 squadrons in 4 years. In December, there's a further blow to attempts to limit global rearmament when Japan announces it will not renew the Washington Naval Treaty.
So this is one I sort of referenced earlier.
Signed in 1922, the treaty had fixed the size of British, American, and Japanese fleets in the ratio 5-5-3.
You can see why Japan is interested in breaking this one.
This is now seen as an insult to Japan's status as a major power. Though one Japanese naval officer has pointed out that the treaty may have been to Japan's advantage, given the US's far greater industrial capacity.
Yeah, right.
He is Rear Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack.
Oh my.
Thank you to Hearts of Iron 4 for sponsoring this video.
Okay, well, there you go. Like I said earlier, their video is linked down below. A bit of a disheartening one, honestly. I mean, it's not like I'm unfamiliar with the history, but just watching the buildup of fascism and militarism in the lead up to the most destructive war we've ever known, certainly is not an uplifting video, but definitely an interesting one, I'll say that. So if you guys enjoyed this one or found it interesting, I would appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and it'll give you access to years worth of exclusive content, including full movie reactions, including reactions to Master and Commander and Gladiator, to Russell Crowe movies. So how about that? So with that, thank you all for watching. I hope to see you all again next time. Goodbye.